Greeting pilots and welcome to Flight Academy. My name is Kavakis, or otherwise known as Flyteco in SWTOR. And today is the second part of our GSF tutorial guide series thing. Today, we're going to be going over a few things of importance. These are going to be the final things before we start breaking into the shield, or not the shield, the ship breakdowns, and these are kind of the baseline understandings for the crew. Today I'm going to be touching on ship upgrade paths and the values for requisition on specific nodes, and kind of a baseline understanding of what each ship class is meant to do and what the generic feel for each one is going to be. So first things first, we're going to be starting on the crew, which, as I stated in the last video, is kind of a multifaceted thing. If you open up your hangar and you go to the crew section here, it's going to be different for every single ship. So whichever one, these aren't universal. If you change it on one ship, it's not going to change it on the other. So if I kind of shift through all my ships here, you'll see that I have different ones for different ships. This does change, and I will have all of my builds in a guide for you to read. I don't necessarily want to go into every single crew option, as it is tedious and there's a lot that goes into understanding the crew. But there's some nice little generalizations that I'm going to make here that are going to help you to understand the point of every single one of these slots. So starting with your co-pilot slot, this is what provides your 4-key ability. This is your co-pilot ability. These are selected from the other 4 options that you have picked. So as you can see, I have T7 already selected, so he's up here. Zenith is selected, so he's here. Kendra is selected, so she's there, and Nadia's here selected, so she's there. These change, so if I change T7 to Ashy per se, you'll see it changed to Ashy, and so on and so forth. If you want to pick for a specific ability, you'll see that that's listed over here on the right, and it will kind of give you a nice little explanation when you hover over here. It won't say it in here, so you have to have them selected here to see what their abilities are. Otherwise, you have to click through every single one and check down here, which is fine, but it takes a while, and that's kind of a hassle. The other thing you need to know is your co-pilot slot does not provide any other stat buffs, unlike the other 4 slots. This is straight up just for the ability, and will also be for the voiceover that your co-pilot has while flying. Kind of quips about damage and stuff like that. Moving on to your offensive slot, this is related to weapon stats and essentially tied exclusively to your primary and secondary weapons. These range anywhere from ammo increases to cooldown reductions to accuracy to firing arc buffs, etc., etc. They all have different types. They are all still related to primary and secondary, though, so it is a nice place to find your offensive stat tweaking. The co-pilot abilities for these are commonly offensive, with the exception of a few here, and kind of that's it too much. They're more or less all offensive. Even this one's technically offensive, Hydra Spanner, which we'll get into when we get into the engineering, but more or less all offensive. Defense, or defensive stat. These are primarily related to shield and otherwise hull-related stat increases like damage reduction and evasion. These are where you find all your stat tweaks for damage reduction, evasion, shield power, and shield power regeneration. Generally speaking, damage reduction and evasion are 2 that are kind of little annoying to learn, so for that, I recommend stick to most guides you see out there, as an understanding of defenses or of damage reduction and evasion is fairly weird and kind of gets into the heavy math side of GSF, and for that, it's annoying for everyone, so I'll leave it at that. Tweak these as you see fit. If you kind of begin to understand what they do, you can tweak what you want on a ship a little bit heavier. So most give like a shield power and secondary buff. Shield power and damage reduction are shield power and damage reduction and shield power and evasion are the 2 most common and the 2 best options. So kind of go with that as you will. Most of the options in here aren't necessarily too defensive. They're more utilitarian to a degree, but most of them remain in a slightly defensive, whether it be defensive towards yourself or defensive in the sense that it is affecting an enemy in some way, with the exclusion of M1 and Nadia, and to a degree Oro, but they're these are technically defensive co-pilot traits, so that's where you'll find these. There are some like bypass, which are just straight up damage boost. Don't let it lie to you; it's a damage increase. But you'll find defense stuff in here mostly. Moving to tactical, this is the single least important co-pilot or crew slot in the game, as these are attached to your sensors. And sensors in GSF are really weird, and frankly, there is no good way to describe the benefits you gain to the cons of taking another one, as some of them, like sensor focus range, aren't necessarily described anywhere, but as you can imagine, sensor radius is how far you can see from your ship. Communication range, which is actually the strongest sensor in the game, is actually how far your ship can read other ships. So say you're like kind of flying towards a point and you have a friendly there. The second you get within your communication range, you're going to see what your friendly sees within their sensor radius. So communication range is one of the more important ones. Sensor dampening is essentially the range at which enemies can't see you. So it's the circle around you that says this is how much extra range you need to see me. And this is why I say it's kind of weird. But more or less, these are fairly unimportant. The co-pilot abilities in here are generally kind of mixed and really weird. You'll see a lot of accuracy and evasion stuff in here, suppressions in here. It's kind of all just a big old mess. So, search through these and see what you want. Generally speaking, bombers want communication, so do gunships, etc., etc. These will be in my build guide, so look forward to that to see what co-pilots I picked and for what builds. And in engineering, these are for your engine and weapon power pool, not necessarily weapon stat buffs. So what that means is these are meant to increase the amount of engine power and amount of blaster pool power you have, and will also reduce the cost of engine component abilities, and sometimes reduce the cost of using blasters, which is the more aggressive option. T7 is replaced imp side by something else for the Hydra Spanner slot. So if you're learning early on, Hydra Spanner is the co-pilot ability. It is the safest one you can choose. So what is going to happen is on imp side, the pilot option that is associated with that is more associated with engines, and over here on rep side, T7 is the one that has Hydra Spanner and is more associated with blasters. So what you'll see is Imperial and Republic ships are going to swap between Imperials being faster and Republic ships having more firepower, essentially. That's the main difference that you'll find on the run Hydra Spanner to feel safe kind of route that lived in GSF for a little bit. It's not necessarily prevalent now. People have actually branched out a lot. The Hydra Spanner is still really, really good, and it is the safest option, and it can save you from most damage over time effects in GSF, like Proton Missile and a few others. But as I say, once again, these are all kind of varying in type of thing. These are a lot more utility focused, which is kind of nice. But generally speaking, on rep side, you're probably going to be using T7. There are a few builds that I use Theron on, but like not really. So T7 is your friend. I mean, look at him; he's adorable. moving on from that, we are going to be talking about ship upgrading. This is the how to spend your points section of GSF, and this is essentially understanding how the component trees work. If you look here and you look at this, you can kind of understand how it flows just by looking at it. Upgrading points in here always starts from the top of the tree and moves down. So you have to upgrade this first, then this, and then so on and so forth. Weapon systems or your weapons and systems tree, so this slot here, are always going to end at 5 upgrades. That means you'll have 3 static and 2 branches. What these branches do are not, you don't have to purchase both. It is a choice, meaning you purchase one and then you can forever pick between the two so long as you use that option. These are commonly the most expensive of the upgrade paths, as they have really high costs and kind of just it flows nicely between tiers 1 through 3, and then tier 4 and 5 are just really high costs and are generally fairly difficult to purchase early on in a GSF player's career. So tier 4 and 5 are kind of or tier 3 is where it's thought for primary and systems, unless your ship is dictated by its system and or primary weapons. Like the Nova Dive is, it is heavily reliant on its system being tier 5. At least tier 4, but tier 5 is where it really shines. Moving on into the costs. For you to purchase a new part within the primary, secondary, or systems trees, it will cost you 1,000 requisition. To unlock your first tier, it'll cost you 500 requisition. To get to the second tier, it's 1,250, and then 2,500 for the third tier. And on the fourth tier, this is where it jumps pretty high. It goes to 5,000 requisition to purchase this tier. And then at fifth tier, it is an astonishingly high 7,500 requisition, which is super, super expensive when you're early on, but it is not unachievable. So it is always a goal in sight. Of note, purchasing, when I said requisition, this does mean both requisitions. This means you can use partially ship and partially fleet. It will always prioritize using ship requisition first, meaning if you're going to zero out purchasing something, it's going to zero out your ship requisition first, and then take from the fleet requisition pool to kind of give you the extra currency you need to finish upgrading the ship. So moving on, your engines and shields, that are these 2 components here, always end at 3 tiers, with 2 tiers being static and 1 being a choice. The way that these scale, when you purchase a new part, i.e. you buy a new one of these, it costs 750 requisition, so it's slightly more expensive to unlock than some things, but it's still cheaper than weapons and so on. They're the top 3. Then your first tier is going to stay 500, and your second tier is going to stay 1,250, but your third tier is going to jump straight to 5,000. So it stays cheap and then gets really expensive towards the bottom. However, this 5,000 is a little more acceptable, as the total cost of the component is significantly lower than the total cost of one of these. So it is a little bit easier to purchase these than you would otherwise. A decently common practice that you'll see when you're trying to get everything sort of pre-made and get as much benefit as you can out of the requisition you start with, you're going to want to just purchase tier 1 and 2 as they are the cheapest, and then save tier 3 for when you can afford it. Meaning you'll purchase tier 1, tier 2, tier 1, tier 2, tier 1 through 3 on as many of these as possible, and then slowly go tier 3, and then tier 4, 5 on these, which is a good way to save currency. It does kind of stagger the way in which your components will power scale, but when you're learning GSF, that's kind of not too important, as your power scale early is more dictated by your ability to catch on how to fly and how to aim. Moving forward, we have a section down here called minor components. There is always 4 choices. It is 4 options out of, I want to say, 6. It could be 5. No, it's definitely 6. You'll always have you always have some variance of 4 between capacitor, magazine, reactor, sensors, thrusters, and there's something else that I'm missing. I want to say it's like armor or something. Yeah, it's armor. So you always have 4 of those 6. And these are the cheapest components that you can purchase, and as such, I highly recommend you always, always, always purchase your minor components first. This is dictated by what build you're gonna run late game, so I recommend more or less understanding how you as a player will play, and then going back on that, finding a build that suits that kind of style that you want to go for, and then build accordingly. As with the Starguard in particularly, these change a decent chunk, aside from the reactor slot, which always stays the same. But the other 3 change a decent bit, so figure out what you want to do in GSF first, and then build these. And that goes without saying for all of this stuff. The only one that doesn't change is Quick Charge Shield. That's the only slot with the reactor, which ironically they're both the shield slots, don't change. Moving on to the cost for these, to unlock a new component, it is 500 requisition, making it the cheapest unlock of the 3 types. Its tier 1 stays at 500, but its tier 2 goes to a nice soft 750 requisition, and its tier 3 caps out at 1250 requisition, making its grand total come out to about 3,000 for a new part and 2,500 for a part you already a part you start out with. So it's very nice to purchase. As I say, it is common practice to just straight out upgrade these. These are just flat stat buffs. It's a power capacity, it's a shield buff, it's everything. These are great. They are the #1 way to get cheap stats in GSF that isn't learning how to min-max the crew. And the crew can get fairly expensive, so with that said, this is still the cheapest way. And now, with the knowledge of how to upgrade ships and how constant stuff will work, we're going to move on to the core style for each ship class. This does not, however, dictate styles within the class. This kind of goes with the generic understanding of what they do, and less so what each ship is meant to do. As each ship in GSF is very unique, and more or less all have their place in the game, and you'll notice that when you start branching out from the Starguard and your starting ships and kind of figure out what you want to play, you'll learn very quickly that each ship changes drastically. The one exclusion is more or less scouts, but there's still a lot of variance there, so keep that in mind. So starting out with the Strike Fighters, this is your most commonly aggressive ship standard. It is the gold standard for hold, left click, or right click, down, and win. It is a very simple ship, and as such, it has the lowest learning curve of the entire game, in my opinion. I'm sure people will say that strikes are hard to learn. Some people will think that. I personally don't think that, as they are the synthesis of what GSF really means. They are the most purest form of how to play GSF, with the exclusion of the Clarion on right side. But that is because that ship is just weird. As such, there is the subtype for a combat support that is specifically the Clarion, so don't worry about that too much. However, one thing I will admit is these ships have a very high skill ceiling with game knowledge. And what this means is the more you know about maps and kind of more risky flying patterns and learning line of sight and all that stuff, you'll make these ships feel stronger. Not necessarily in terms of stat power, but in terms of survivability and overall offensive capability. As the better you are as a flyer, the more you'll be able to hunt people, and the more you'll be able to survive from escaping in weird ways that otherwise people wouldn't want to follow you through, like flying through certain obstacles and stuff like that. Moving on to scouts. Scouts are commonly the sort of glass cannon-ish subtype of ships. They have a sub-archetype kind of smattered throughout as aggressive utility. And what that I wrote on my notes aggressive in parentheses because it is not your traditional type of aggressive. This is not your it deals damage aggressive. This is your it disrupts people aggressive. Commonly meaning it will either buff or debuff. It'll either buff your team or debuff your enemies in a way that swings the advantage to make your team's aggression favorable in a specific matchup. So there's that in mind. I argue to say scouts have a fairly moderate learning curve, as they have just flat out less health, and they have more speed. And I know that doesn't sound like a bad thing, but when you're trying to learn how to fly a ship, it can be a bad thing. Because as you're flying at higher speeds, you are also having to sort of take in the knowledge of your surroundings a lot faster, and it requires a decent bit of processing of your brain to understand how you're going to move, as you need to think more ahead with scouts. You can't really think in the moment. You have to think, what am I going to do next? Not what am I doing now? Of course, that changes if you're in a scenario where you're being chased, and then you have to go, okay, well, what do I need to do? Then that's the case with all ships, though, so there's that. But these have an extremely high skill ceiling, as, of course, game knowledge plays a heavy role, as with the strike fighters. However, as your playstyle changes to fit the scouts, you will also understand how to utilize their kits heavier. This actually will turn out to make your ship feel stronger from a direct, damaging output. Because as you learn to adjust for ranges and kind of fill in the shorter range and evasive nature that the scouts really need from you as a player, it will cater to you quickly, and you'll kind of meld with the ship a little bit better and be able to keep it alive, which is very important on scouts. One of the most common things you take on a scout is rocket pods, and the number one thing you'll hear from good end scout players is usually they'll complain about running out of rocket pods. This is not common. If you run out of rockets, that probably means you either missed all of them, which is bad, or you did something really good and stayed alive so long that you had time to fire all of them off, which is very rare, actually. So if you ever do that, that means you're probably having a good scout game, or you're not contributing. One of those is really good, one of those is really bad. You know which is which. Moving on to gunships, I actually went out of order here because bombers, in my opinion, are simple, and I wanted to address gunships first because I've seen a lot of people want to play these, so I like to address them more commonly than I do like to address bombers. Bombers are still played a lot, but gunships are for some reason gravitated towards a lot heavier. So, gunships are commonly your sniper ship. These don't necessarily have a subtype to them. They're pretty heavily just snipers. Almost all of them has what is known as a railgun, which is, as it says, a long-range sniper-ish weapon. These do require a decent bit of skill. There is a very strong learning curve to these, and that's kind of why I tend to tell people to avoid them when you're learning GSF early on, as gunships are slow and have sort of just kind of a rugged feel. If you're trying to escape people and don't quite know how to fly very well, you're gonna die a lot more than you would on any other ship, as other ships just have the speed to help you escape. Gunships don't have that. Gunships and bombers don't. So there is a very high learning curve to learning how to escape with this ship, and there is a secondary learning curve in tandem with that curve that requires team structuring and ship synergies. This is knowing how your ship plays with other ships and knowing how your team can benefit from having a gunship. That is sort of kind of in the middle to late half of the first learning curve. So once you get into the gunship mindset, that's when you start integrating your team into it. Of course, you want to be playing well as a cohesive unit to begin with, but if you are playing as a new person, playing with a team is kind of difficult and requires a decent bit of concentration to split your attention from how you're flying and kind of speaking directions to your teammates and understanding their locations. It's fairly hard, and even myself, I struggle with it a little bit. Granted, I fly solo a lot more, so it doesn't really come up, but still, it's important. It's an important skill to have as a gunship. Gunships, on the other hand, to make up for their decently high skill requirement, have an excruciatingly high skill ceiling. Um, Veteran gunships are terrifying, and frankly, ruin GSF as they make they make life feel impossible because you really can't pin down a good gunship, and they have essentially mastered the art of quick shotting and will burst you before you even get in range to kill them. So it's spooky, and once you understand how to play gunships in the long range, and you start learning how to play in that close quarters sort of fight or die scenarios, you start to get spooky because the faster you can aim a gunship in close range, or the faster you can move your gunship in close range and kind of evade and strafe and snap targets and do all this cool stuff, the more people are going to fear you. And generally, fearing a gunship means you're going to be focused a lot more, but that's a good thing because the second you start realizing that they're just going to fly at you, you can just pick them off before they're going to get to you, and you don't have to get into those close quarter scenarios. So, gunships are hard to learn, but really rewarding. And I love gunships. This slot is permanently glued to this particular gunship, and sometimes the other two, but I prefer this one. Moving on to bombers. Man, these are basic. Bombers are your common defensive ship. They're really strong for point control, and what this means is because they use mines and other things instead of missiles and so forth and so on, they are not necessarily denying an offensive sector of a map. They're sitting in one spot, setting up their mines, setting up whatever they have to, and absolutely dominating that area. If a bomber has time to set up and place their mines really well, there is no point in time that an enemy can just pierce through that. It's very difficult to fight a good bomber, and as such, their learning curves are a bit weird. I would argue they have a low to moderate learning curve. What this means is on the lower end, they're fairly easy to learn. In domination in particular, you fly to a point, you place your mines, you sit at the point. That is the bomber playstyle. The more moderate half of that is learning positioning of other bomber classes. So the sledgehammer and war carrier on rep side, these have sentry drones and other things that you have to worry about. And learning to position those is a fairly separate and decently hard learning curve, as positioning comes with map knowledge, and map knowledge comes with time. So that one is slightly time gated, but also you have to be creative with it. So the more creative you start to become with your placement of things with bombers, the higher or the easier the learning curve will be for you. As well as the bomber learning curve is strongly attached to game modes. Bombers are really easy in domination and really hard in team deathmatch. So hard to the fact that playing bomber in team deathmatch is honestly considered just trolling, and you're making your team worse for it most of the time. There are certain times when bombers are very appreciated in TDM, but these are in team environments. This means you are playing with people pre-queued, and you are going in saying, "I want to play a bomber," and your team is helping to build a scenario where you can play your bomber successfully. Most people will not help you play bombers if you're flying solo. They will frankly ignore you, and you'll either be focused really hard and people will try and kill you quickly, or you will be ignored and you might get reported for being AFK, even though you're just trying to play a bomber. So just be careful in TDM with bombers. Another thing, sorry, the learning curve for bombers, as I said, is weird. The other hard part about the bomber learning curve is understanding how to play with your team and point positioning. This comes differently for each bomber. So when we get to the bomber's breakdown, I will explain how each bomber is more or less meant to place, and I'll get more in depth with that. With all this said, the bombers don't have a very high skill ceiling. There's not too much to play around with. So just with the simplicity of the kit alone, there isn't too much to learn, and there isn't too much to gain from learning these things, because as you learn the kit, it kind of just plays like you'd imagine. But the skill ceiling comes down to a stronger knowledge of how to position, and in team deathmatch in particular, learning how to spot traffic. And what I mean by traffic is spotting an area of activity where you can both safely and aggressively position yourself to set up as a bomber and bait enemies towards you by just existing. Enemies will kind of flock to you as they hate bombers for some reason and want to kill you. So you could take advantage of that, place a bunch of mines, and kill them before they get there. As long as you place your mines smart, you'll do great things. I've had a few friends now, and great teammates that played bombers almost nearly all the time and did pretty good. So there is a good position for bombers to be in GSF. And with that, that is the end of this video. This one was slightly shorter, but as you can imagine, not as short. Moving on from this, we're going to be going on into the actual ship breakdowns, I believe. I don't actually remember, as it has been a while since I wrote them. Yes, that is exactly what it's going to be. Yeah, you might have seen a flash of that. You might have seen a flash of my notes on the screen. I hope you didn't, but you might have. So, we're going to be going into the strike fighters first, and I'm practically going to go down the list. I'm going to skip bombers again and go straight to gunships and then loop back around to bombers, as I believe gunships are slightly more complex and deserve a little bit more time than bombers, as bombers really just, with the exclusion of one of them being the sledgehammer, are really straightforward and fairly easy to learn. So I hope you look forward to seeing that in the near future, and good luck out there, pilots, and have a wonderful day.